Deep in the center of the Vatican, behind the doors that have not been opened for centuries, there lies a document yellowed and fragile with age. Its surface still shows traces of ink, dried tears, and small dark marks that experts cautiously describe as biological traces. But the importance of this letter is not in the material itself. It is a confession that was never supposed to be read by other people's eyes. On the thin paper is written the confession of a 14-year-old girl who found herself caught in one of the darkest traps in history. Her pen trembled with fear, but every line kept the anger and pain beyond her years. The name of the author is well known to anyone who has ever read about the dynasties of Europe. It was Catherine de Medici, a Florentine heiress whose life seemed to be written in advance as a brilliant alliance between powerful families. She was sent to France not as a child, but as a part of a political agreement. She was promised prestige, a title and influence, but the truth turned out to be the opposite. Where she expected the crown, she was met with a ritual that even the bravest chroniclers never dared to describe. Historians wrote about the marriage, about the magnificent celebrations in Marseille, about music and wine that flowed endlessly, but the secret hidden behind these festivities was revealed only a century later. The letter uncovered something that was never mentioned in the official chronicles. The girl, who was supposed to start a new life as the wife of the prince, was drawn into a ritual that the court called purification. Nobody recorded its rules in writing. Everything was passed quietly in whispers, from old noblemen to new ones, as a dark legacy that lived beside the brilliance of the palace halls. She walked through the corridors of the palace, illuminated by torches, and thought that behind the thick walls awaited the night that poets called the night of marriage. But what was ahead of her was a test meant to break her spirit, not to bring intimacy. Each step gave an alarming beat to her heart. Every shadow on the wall looked alive. She did not know that dozens of eyes, ready to watch, were already hidden behind secret openings in the stone walls. In her letter, Catherine described this moment not in a dry way, but with such emotional strength that even after centuries the lines seemed alive. She told how that night, along with her silk gloves and wedding gown, she was stripped not only of her outer covering but also of her sense of safety forever. What happened behind the closed doors changed her from the inside. Where there was supposed to be trust in her new family and her husband, there appeared betrayal and cold determination. It was in that moment, as researchers wrote, that something broke inside her. But in the place of lost innocence appeared a new knot, tight, firm, ready to hold her through every storm. Her inner voice for the first time said what would become the meaning of her entire life. Everything will be recorded. Everything will be remembered. That day, Marseille shone like the showcase of the empire. The streets were full of music and noise, wine was poured freely, and the crowd greeted the union of France with the powerful Florentine family. Everyone saw only the outer side, the celebration, the luxury, the promise of a new era. But behind the palace walls, where the roar of voices turned into a distant echo, a scene was being prepared that remained hidden for centuries. The 14-year-old bride walked through the stone corridors, accompanied by servants. Candles trembled in her hands, and her gaze revealed tension despite her practiced calmness. In the monastery of St. Lucy, she was taught to keep her expression steady, to hide her emotions, and to maintain perfect posture. But even that discipline could not drown out the premonition. The thin silk of her gloves was already soaked with sweat, and every step felt like a movement toward the inevitable. The prince to whom she was promised was only a year older. Henry of Orleans, strong in body, but too submissive in soul. His life had long been under the influence of a woman much older than him, Diane de Poitiers. She not only ruled his heart but also guided his behavior. It was her cold hand that prepared the humiliation that was waiting. Everything that awaited Catherine behind the door was not a romantic beginning of marriage but a carefully staged act. 23 noblemen watched through the secret holes in the wall. Their faces were hidden from the torchlight, but their eyes shone, reflecting curiosity and expectation. Some made bets, others laughed quietly, and others raised their cups. Each of them took part in a custom that had been repeated for centuries but never appeared in any records. It was a secret ritual meant to show that a foreign princess entering the royal family had to pass a test. The first expectation was deceitful. The bride was waiting for affection, for a word of comfort, at least for some sign of trust. But very soon the situation turned into a cruel game. False warmth was replaced by cold indifference. Henry acted as he had been taught, and laughter and whispers of invisible observers filled the air. Catherine tried to speak. Her Italian words sounded like cries for help, but they only added fuel to the mockery. The stronger she resisted, the more joy her despair brought them. She remembered that moment in her letter with terrifying clarity. The walls seemed alive. Every shadow mocked her. At one point, the blood vessels in her eyes burst from extreme strain, and the tears that ran down her cheeks took on a purplish color. The royal doctor brought her back to her senses several times, but every return to consciousness only meant the continuation of torment. Until dawn, she kept losing and regaining consciousness, surrounded by whispers, laughter, and the gaze of strangers. When the first light appeared behind the windows, it was no longer the same girl who had entered the bridal chamber. Silence froze on her face, but all the faces, all the voices, every movement were forever kept in her memory. That silence was not a sign of defeat. On the contrary, it became her armor. A power was already born inside her, which would turn her from a victim into a player. The next morning, solemn silence reigned in the palace. For everyone else, the wedding was considered a success, and the rituals were carried out properly, as required by tradition. But those who looked into Catherine's eyes in the first days after the ordeal could not help but notice the change. Outwardly, she kept her politeness, bowed, smiled, and accepted congratulations. Inside, there was already quiet reflection, which gave rise not to weakness, but to iron determination. She stopped speaking without need. She was seen less often at feasts and receptions, not as a participant in conversations, but as a silent figure in expensive clothing, who listened more than she spoke. People used to think of her as modest and fragile, but her silence hid calculation. She watched everyone who had been in the hall that terrible night, memorizing habits, expressions, and relationships among them. The studies that once burdened her in childhood now had another purpose. Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, Greek, all the languages she had mastered by the age of 12, became tools for understanding other people's conversations and secret letters. Her knowledge of history and politics became a map for navigating the labyrinth of the court. Even the alchemy lessons that once seemed strange and amusing in the monastery were now remembered differently. Herbs, infusions, and powders could serve not only as remedies. In the evening, when she was alone, she took thin sheets of paper and a pen. Names appeared on them, 23 surnames. Next to each, a short note. A voice, a look, a gesture, a laugh. She wrote everything down with the precision of an archivist, as if it were not a diary, but a book of destinies. Those notes were not laments. They were a dossier that one day would become a sentence. Her husband, young Henry, noticed no change. He still remained under the influence of Diane de Poitiers, and Catherine appeared to him a quiet, obedient wife. But it was this mask that saved her. She mastered the art of survival, not to show emotions, not to challenge directly, not to rush. In the depths of her soul, she swore that none of those who witnessed her humiliation would go unpunished. Silence became her sharpest weapon. Every gesture of obedience to the court became another layer of defense. Every bow or smile hid anger that gradually hardened like steel. The court considered her an obedient Florentine, but a new figure was forming. A strategist, a spider weaving a web where Catherine herself would become the mistress of its center. It was in those years that she understood the main rule of survival at court, to reveal one's cards only when the moment is perfect. Everything else was only preparation, a slow but relentless movement toward the goal. 3 years passed. For the court, these were years of silence, when the young wife seemed to dissolve in luxury and daily duties. No one saw a threat in her. She seemed humble, devoted to traditions, studying French manners and family habits. But behind this calm image lay hard work. Each night she returned to her secret list, reread the names, recalled fragments of memory, and clarified the smallest details. Gradually, from a simple list of surnames, it turned into a carefully planned map of revenge. The first image that arose in her mind was the face of Jean-Nadia Montmorency. He was one of those who not only watched but also placed bets, guessing how long the Italian girl would endure. His cold eyes and slow sip of wine were forever etched in her memory. When Catherine remembered that evening, it was his face that awakened disgust and determination within her. For her first step, she did not choose an easy method. She had studied the properties of plants and minerals since childhood, and now that knowledge had gained a special purpose. In one of the abandoned rooms of the palace, where servants rarely came, she arranged a small laboratory. There, among glass vessels and dried herbs, a mixture was born, on which she worked for months. Poisonous seeds, rare compounds of mercury, and extracts from plants known for their deceitful effects. The result was not an immediate blow. On the contrary, the substance acted slowly, turning every hour into suffering. At first came weakness, then convulsions, and later unbearable pain. In each of these stages was reflected the torment that Catherine herself had experienced on her wedding night. Her creation was not simply a weapon. It was a mirror in which the victim saw and felt the same agony once forced upon her. Winter brought its cold morning light, when Jean's lifeless body was found. At court, people began to speak of food poisoning. Some blamed the careless cook, others the old wine. No one even thought to look toward the young duchess. She was seen at one of the festivities, her face lit by a polite smile, her voice calm and soft. But behind the scenes, deep within her private chambers, there stood a small glass jar with traces of a dark liquid and a note containing a single word, a reminder of the night that once seemed to mark the end of her life. Now it had become the beginning of her path. This first act became a signal for her. Justice could be achieved quietly, without attracting suspicion. From that day, her determination only grew stronger. She understood that her greatest strength was to remain invisible until her enemies disappeared one by one. The court whispered about the unseen Catherine, about a strange curse that seemed to haunt those who had laughed too loudly at the wedding night of the young Florentine. Yet no one connected those mysterious deaths with the woman who still bowed modestly and kept the image of a humble wife. After the first act, there was no turning back. Every evening, when Catherine opened her diary, the lines on its pages were no longer just words. They had become verdicts. She knew that now all those names had to vanish one after another. Without haste, she chose moments when no one could suspect a connection, and each new victim disappeared as silently as a shadow fading in the corridor after a candle went out. The court lived on rumors. People discussed strange happenings. Strong and healthy courtiers suddenly lost their strength, fell ill with unknown ailments, and nothing could save them. Physicians tried to help, believing it an accident, a weakness of the body, or the strange will of heaven. But Catherine knew that nothing happened by chance. She selected not only those who had laughed that night, but also those who later allowed themselves crude remarks. Each of them received their own mark of punishment. For one, a dark tincture mixed with wine. For another, a seasoning that turned food into poison. And each time, a sign remained nearby. A small glass with a thick red liquid or a short phrase recalling that secret night in Marseille. These messages were meant only for them, yet they contained the meaning of all her revenge. None of the witnesses would be forgotten. Meanwhile, Catherine skillfully maintained the appearance of a gentle wife. She attended banquets, smiled, followed the protocol, and her modest image confused even the most watchful courtiers. Those who noticed the pattern in the chain of mysterious deaths quickly turned their suspicion away from her. She seemed too young, too harmless to be part of such a complex intrigue. In the palace corridors, among the servants and pages, other stories began to spread. People whispered about a curse, about a mysterious force that punished those who had taken part in the purification ritual. And the more names vanished, the greater the fear became. Even those who had never known the true events of that wedding night began to feel the touch of an unseen threat. The rumors grew richer with mystic details. Someone claimed to hear footsteps at night in the empty halls. Someone else spoke about a strange herbal smell coming from cups and plates. But the truth was simpler and far more terrible. None of it was fate or curse. It was the work of one woman. Quiet, invisible but determined. She had turned her own knowledge into a weapon, and the memory of her past into a plan of action. With every new disappearance, her confidence grew stronger. She realized she could finish what she had started. And although the list was shrinking slowly, it was all part of her plan. Any haste could ruin everything. There was no time in her thoughts, only patience. And at the center of that list stood one name surrounded by particular coldness: Diane de Poitiers. She was not just a witness, but the orchestrator of that night's events. The true mistress of humiliation. Her face became for Catherine the symbol of something that could never be forgiven. And for her, revenge had to be prepared unlike any other. The name Diane de Poitiers stood out in her secret records with a special mark. She was not simply a participant of the disgrace but its creator. A woman who guided every movement of young Henry, turning the wedding night into a performance of mockery. In Catherine's memory, her image remained unbroken. That cold gaze, the certainty of complete control over the prince, the calm smile of the woman directing another's suffering. Thus, revenge upon her could not be swift. It had to become a reflection of the same slow torture once endured by a 14-year-old girl. Catherine knew that it was impossible to remove Diane with a single strike. This woman was too deeply rooted in court life, too skillful in using influence and intrigue. Her network of allies and her word carried weight even with the king. And precisely for that reason, Catherine chose another path, a long, almost invisible strategy. She decided to exhaust her slowly, drop by drop, as if filling a vessel until it cracked. The wine and food of Diane became the key. Catherine knew how to combine microscopic doses of substances that would not raise suspicion. At first, it was almost unnoticeable fatigue, attributed to age, then occasional dizziness, moments of confusion. Over time, her steps became less steady, her skin lost its shine, and her eyes their familiar brightness. To others, it all seemed like natural aging. Only Catherine knew of her invisible intervention. The years passed and Diane, once the brilliant favorite, began to fade little by little. She still held herself with pride, still remained close to the king, but her power was dissolving. When she raised her cup of wine, Catherine looked at her with the same courteous smile, behind which was hidden icy calculation. This became a kind of personal trial for Catherine herself, to endure years of watching, to give no hint of her true purpose, and to savor each new sign of weakness that appeared in her enemy. Diane endured longer than anyone else on the list. But that was what Catherine intended. Her downfall had to stretch like the shadow of the setting sun. When Diane turned 66, the physicians began to speak of natural ailments. Yet modern analysis of the preserved descriptions points to clear signs of long-term poisoning, gradual destruction of internal organs, slow exhaustion. She died with a cup of wine in her hand, offered by Catherine. And it was not merely an act of courtesy. It was the final note in the symphony that Catherine had been composing for decades. For the Duchess herself, it was a moment of silence. There were no public words, no open celebration. But inside Catherine, it felt as if a great weight had fallen away. One of the main symbols of her humiliation was gone, and with it vanished part of the pain that had lived in her heart for 14 years. Yet her list was not finished. In the palace corridors still echoed the steps of courtiers whose names were written in her secret diary. Over all of them hung fear. Not spoken, but real. The rumors of unseen punishment grew stronger, and each new mysterious death only deepened the dread. Catherine continued to appear an obedient, unnoticeable woman, while in truth she had become the mistress of shadows. After Diane's death, her path did not end. On the contrary, the absence of the favorite only emphasized the strength of the young Florentine. Now her diary was no longer merely a collection of memories. It had turned into a map on which she moved with certainty, erasing one witness after another. Each new target was chosen with the same precision as the first. For one courtier, the wine became bitter. For another, Food brought sudden weakness. Sometimes the illness lasted weeks, sometimes it came in a single night, but the mark never changed. A small glass with a thick red liquid, left where only the intended one would find it. It was her mark, her silent signature, clear only to them. The court sank into unease. No one dared speak openly, but whispers spread. Some murmured it was divine punishment for a secret ritual. Others claimed the young queen practiced sorcery. Servants told tales of how, at night, rare herbal aromas filled her chambers, as if candles with exotic infusions were burning there. Even those who had nothing to do with the events of the wedding night began to fear her. Outwardly, however, Catherine remained unchanged. She appeared at celebrations, attended official receptions, smiled, and bowed. Her hands were calm, her eyes gentle, her voice soft and restrained. No one saw danger in her, and this was what allowed her to continue her plan without the slightest suspicion. Every name that was crossed out in the list made her stronger. It was not only revenge, it was a return of power over her own destiny. With each step, she proved to herself that she would no longer be a victim. Now she was the one who decided who could live in peace and who would receive punishment. But the most important name in the list still remained untouched. Her husband, Henry of Orleans, later Henry II, the same young man who followed the instructions of his mentor that night. He was not only a witness, he was the performer. And even though his hands trembled then from youth and submission to another's will, it did not matter to Catherine. His image stayed as a symbol of her humiliation, and so his fate had to become unique in its scale and meaning. She did not hurry. For many years she was preparing, studying, and waiting for the moment when the blow would become not only personal, but also political. His end had to become a scene that everyone would watch, just as they had once watched her. It was her great plan, to turn the memory of pain into a spectacle of revenge that would enter the chronicles of Europe. Around her, at that time, a mysterious halo had already appeared. People stopped seeing only the king's wife in her. She became a figure whose presence was felt even in silence. And if earlier only those who remembered that night feared her, now fear spread to everyone. The tournament in Paris gathered all the nobility of the kingdom. Bright tents, voices of artisans, music that made the flags shake. This day was conceived as a festival of peace and a demonstration of power. For many, it became the final, a carefully planned ending that completed the long game begun many years ago. Catherine sat in her honorable lodge, surrounded by ladies and advisors, and watched not just the game of lances. She watched the realization of what was built as the final chapter of her plan. When the knights passed along the platform, the air became heavy with tension. Henry accepted the challenge with great confidence. The same pride appeared on his face. For most spectators, it was an ordinary moment, royal skill, honor, ceremony. For her, it was the culmination of 20 years of preparation. Her eyes followed every movement, every second of fate. At the moment of the strike, when the lances collided and the crowd gasped, the smallest detail decided everything. A metal fragment broke through a gap in the visor and hit the place where no one had expected danger before. Panic started immediately. Doctors ran to the wounded king. The crowd loudly discussed what had happened. In a few moments, the festive field turned into a place of fear. Henry spent the next days in pain and torment. Fever, convulsions, and delirious visions dragged on, turning the accident into a long performance of suffering. Modern scientists, studying the surviving medical notes and analysis of some materials, came to the conclusion that one wound could not explain such a long agony. Traces of unknown organic matter were found, a layer that, according to experts, intensified the damage and caused gradual destruction. Nobody at court could prove it, but for Catherine, the picture was clear. The final note of her long game struck not only his body, but also his power and reputation. During those 10 days, when the king was between life and death, Catherine remained calm. Her face did not show emotion, and her hands held the fan as if it were an ordinary court matter. But inside her, what had held her for many years was gone. Her revenge took a form visible to everyone, not a secret act, but a fate recorded in history. After the tournament, a sign appeared in the Queen's chamber known only to her. 3 intersecting circles with a vertical line, a symbol that she had once carved in anger on the wall of the wedding room, now appeared on the monument as a silent confession. The circle was closed. For most people, it was just an engraving, a strange relic of the time. But for those who knew how to read between the lines, it was the final note of the story of a woman who, once deprived of peace and hope, turned her pain into strength. But the story did not end with one list of names. The yellowed pages, faded papers, and ink preserved in the Vatican archives keep similar stories across Europe. There are other names, women whose experiences and losses were wrapped in the same quiet, cruel wisdom. These discoveries give a new view of politics and of how the personal became a tool of power. If this story has caught your attention, there are still many more doors in the archives. Tell me, whose secret do you want to uncover next? Which historical figure should we reveal in the light of her own hidden truth?